He said it from the podium at Davos. I won't use force. Pause. But we would be unstoppable. And while the world focused on the contradiction, on the diplomatic crisis, on the NATO alliance fracturing in real time, something else was happening. Something the cameras didn't show. Something the headlines buried beneath geopolitical theater. Gold hit $488 per ounce. Silver touched $95, all-time highs. Both metals, simultaneously, as the President of the United States threatened 8 European nations with escalating tariffs unless they hand over Greenland. This isn't about an island covered in ice. This isn't about national security or Arctic strategy. This is about the final stage of imperial collapse, and the markets are pricing it in exactly as history predicts. Because when empires enter their terminal phase, when the mathematics of debt and resource consumption become impossible to maintain, they always do the same thing. They grab for physical assets. They threaten allies. They weaponize trade. They choose expansion over cooperation. And precious metals, the ultimate store of value, the assets that survive every monetary crisis, surge to levels that seemed impossible just months before. Let me show you what's really happening. Because once you see the pattern, once you understand where we are in this cycle, everything else becomes clear. The Greenland crisis isn't separate from the precious metals explosion. It's the cause of it. The numbers tell a story that mainstream analysis won't touch. Gold has gained 75% over the past 12 months. But that's not the remarkable part. The remarkable part is the acceleration. In just the 3 days since Trump announced tariffs on Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, and Finland, gold has added another 3.7%, while silver has surged over 6%. That's not normal market behavior. That's crisis pricing. That's what happens when investors realize they're watching something unprecedented in modern history. A sitting American president threatening military action against NATO allies while simultaneously launching economic warfare against the Western alliance. The precious metals aren't just responding to geopolitical uncertainty. They're responding to the recognition that the global order established after World War II is disintegrating. And when established orders collapse, when currencies lose credibility, when institutions fail, gold and silver become the ultimate refuge. But here's what makes this different from previous precious metals rallies. This isn't driven by inflation fears or monetary policy speculation. This is driven by imperial overstretch, by the mathematical impossibility of maintaining global dominance through debt-financed expansion. Look at what Trump actually said about Greenland, not the diplomatic language, not the strategic justifications, the raw economic calculation. We need Greenland for national security. Denmark can't defend it. We can. Translation, we need the resources. We need the strategic position. We need something tangible to secure our position as the existing system breaks down. Greenland holds 25% of the world's rare earth elements, critical for technology, for defense systems, for renewable energy infrastructure. It sits on the Northwest Passage, which climate change is making navigable for the first time in human history. It contains massive untapped oil and mineral deposits worth trillions of dollars. Let's be real for a second. What we're seeing on the world stage isn't just about politics. It's about resources. It's about securing assets before someone else does and turning military might into economic advantage while it's still possible. The precious metals markets get this. As Robin Brooks from the Brookings Institution said, the debasement trade is on fire. And it's not just about printing more money. We're talking about a systemic breakdown. Political, institutional, the very rules that have shaped global relations for 80 years are crumbling. When rules no longer apply, when trust in institutions evaporates, and currencies are used as weapons, where does capital go? It flees to the only things that hold value outside of any political system: gold and silver. For 5,000 years, through the rise and fall of every empire, these metals have preserved wealth. What we're seeing isn't new, it's history repeating itself. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more insights. The timing reveals everything. Trump's Greenland offensive isn't random. It's not impulsive. It's strategic positioning for what's coming next. Because the people advising him understand something that most analysts don't. The current system is mathematically unsustainable. The debt, the deficits, the trade imbalances, the demographic trends, none of it adds up. None of it can continue. So you secure what you can while you can. You grab strategic resources. You control choke points. You position for the reset that's coming whether you plan it or not. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet hit $9 trillion at its peak. They printed more money in the last 4 years than in the previous 230 years combined. The national debt grows by $612 billion daily. Interest payments alone exceed $1 trillion annually. These aren't sustainable trends. They're terminal trends. And when unsustainable systems approach their breaking point, when the mathematics finally overwhelm the politics, precious metals don't just perform well. They explode. because they represent the only store of value that doesn't depend on government promises or institutional credibility. The European response to Trump's threats reveals how quickly alliances fracture under pressure. These are supposed to be America's closest allies, countries that have supported U.S. foreign policy for decades, democratic partners with shared values and common interests. And yet, within hours of Trump's announcement, they issued joint statements condemning American aggression. They threatened retaliation. They began coordinating defensive measures. 8 NATO members standing together against the United States. Not against Russia, not against China, against their supposed protector and alliance leader. This is how empires end, not with external conquest, with internal contradiction, with overreach that forces former allies to choose between submission and resistance, with demands so extreme they reveal the desperation beneath the surface. And precious metals are pricing in that reality in real time. The currency markets confirm what the metals are signaling. The dollar has had its largest decline in over a month. Not because of weak economic data, not because of dovish Federal Reserve policy, because investors are recognizing that weaponizing the dollar, using America's reserve currency status to coerce allies, undermines the very foundation of that status. Reserve currency privilege depends on trust, on other countries' willingness to hold dollars, to use dollars, to accept dollars as neutral stores of value. When the reserve currency becomes a tool of coercion, when holding dollars means accepting political subordination, that privilege evaporates. And when reserve currency status erodes, when the exorbitant privilege that has financed American consumption for decades disappears, the adjustment is catastrophic, sudden, unavoidable. The precious metals are anticipating that adjustment. They're pricing in a world where dollar dominance no longer subsidizes American living standards, where resource access requires payment in something more than promises, where military power alone isn't sufficient to maintain economic hegemony. The timing of this crisis, happening simultaneously with Trump's attacks on Federal Reserve independence, creates compounding effects. Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, is under Justice Department investigation for the first time in modern history. Not for economic incompetence, for refusing to subordinate monetary policy to political pressure. This represents the breakdown of institutional independence that has underpinned dollar credibility since the 1970s. If the Federal Reserve becomes a political tool, if monetary policy serves partisan interests rather than economic stability, the dollar's role as neutral reserve currency ends. And when that role ends, when countries can no longer trust that their dollar holdings won't be weaponized against them, they diversify. Into euros, into yen, into yuan, into gold and silver, into anything that isn't controlled by a government that views its currency as a weapon. The precious metals rally reflects this diversification in real time, not just by individuals, by central banks, by sovereign wealth funds, by institutional investors who understand that currency stability depends on political restraint. The Chinese understand this better than anyone. They've been accumulating gold systematically for years, not just buying, accumulating at record levels while restricting silver exports to create supply constraints in global markets. They're positioning for exactly this scenario, for the moment when dollar weaponization forces global diversification. And now that moment is here, triggered not by Chinese aggression or Russian expansion, but by American overreach. By demands so extreme they force allies to recognize that continued dependence on dollar-based systems represents an unacceptable risk. The rare earth element angle adds another dimension to the crisis. Greenland's mineral wealth isn't just about economic value. It's about technological control, about reducing dependence on Chinese supply chains that dominate global rare earth production. But attempting to solve supply chain vulnerabilities through territorial acquisition creates new vulnerabilities, political vulnerabilities, alliance vulnerabilities, credibility vulnerabilities that precious metals markets are pricing aggressively. Because when you threaten allies to secure resources, you demonstrate exactly the kind of desperation that drives capital towards safe havens. You reveal that your system requires continuous expansion to remain viable, that cooperation has become subordination, that partnership has become extraction. And those revelations accelerate the very trends they're meant to address. The silver market dynamics add urgency to the gold story. Silver's industrial applications create supply and elasticity that gold doesn't face. When geopolitical tensions disrupt trade, when sanctions fragment supply chains, when allies become competitors, industrial silver availability contracts sharply. But silver's monetary properties create demand elasticity that industrial uses don't generate. When currencies lose credibility, when inflation expectations rise, when systemic risks increase, monetary demand for silver can overwhelm industrial supply constraints. That's what we're seeing now. Industrial demand continues growing as technology advances. Monetary demand is exploding as systemic risks materialize, and geopolitical tensions are constraining supply through trade disruptions and export restrictions. The result is price action that looks parabolic, but reflects fundamental supply-demand imbalances that aren't resolving anytime soon. The historical parallels are exact. In 1971, when Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility, precious metals exploded as currency credibility collapsed. In 1979, when Iranian crises combined with Soviet expansion, metals hit peaks that seemed impossible until they happened. In 2008, when financial systems failed, gold and silver became the only reliable stores of value. Each crisis revealed the same pattern. When systems break down, when institutions fail, when currencies become political tools, precious metals provide the only escape from systematic wealth destruction. We're experiencing the same pattern now, but amplified. Because this crisis involves not just currency debasement or financial system failure, but the breakdown of the entire international order that has governed global relations since 1945. The Bretton Woods system, NATO, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations Security Council, all the institutions that provided stability for 8 decades are being deliberately undermined by the very country that created them. And precious metals are pricing in a world where those institutions no longer provide the stability they were designed to guarantee. The investment implications are clear but uncomfortable. Traditional portfolio diversification assumes institutional stability. It assumes that governments honor agreements, that allies remain allies, that currencies maintain purchasing power over reasonable time horizons. When those assumptions break down, when institutional stability disappears, traditional portfolios become wealth destruction machines. Bonds issued by unstable governments become worthless. Stocks denominated in debasing currencies lose value. Real estate dependent on political stability faces confiscation risks. Only assets that maintain value independent of political systems provide real protection. And in modern economies, that means precious metals. The acceleration we're seeing suggests the timeline has compressed. What previous generations experienced over decades, we're experiencing in months or years. The internet, global financial markets, and real-time information flows amplify every shock, accelerate every trend, compress every historical pattern. This creates opportunities for those who understand what's happening. But it also creates risks for those who don't. Because when systems change rapidly, when historical patterns accelerate, the window for positioning closes faster than most people realize. The people buying gold and silver at record highs aren't speculating. They're recognizing mathematical realities. When currencies lose reserve status, when institutions lose credibility, when alliances fracture, precious metals don't just preserve wealth. They multiply it relative to assets that depend on system stability. The Greenland crisis isn't ending anytime soon. Trump isn't backing down. European resistance isn't weakening. The fundamental conflict between American demands and Allied sovereignty isn't resolving, which means the institutional breakdown driving precious metals higher isn't temporary, it's structural. And structural breaks don't heal. They accelerate until new equilibria form, usually at levels that seemed impossible when the process began. That's where we are now, in the acceleration phase, when daily price movements that would have been shocking months ago become normal, when levels that seemed like targets become stepping stones, when the impossible becomes inevitable. The traditional financial system depends on trust, cooperation, and institutional stability. When those foundations erode, when trust becomes suspicion, when cooperation becomes coercion, when institutions become weapons, the system doesn't gradually weaken, it suddenly collapses. And precious metals don't gradually appreciate. They explosively revalue to reflect their role as the only stores of value that survive system collapse. We're not just watching a precious metals rally. We're watching the repricing of monetary reality. The recognition that currencies, institutions, and alliances that seemed permanent are actually contingent, dependent on choices that are being made differently now than they were before. The Greenland demands reveal how different those choices have become, how far from cooperation we've moved, how close to breakdown we've arrived. And the precious metals markets are pricing that breakdown in real time, not as speculation, as mathematical certainty. Because when systems become unsustainable, when choices become impossible, when mathematics overwhelm politics, breakdown isn't a risk, it's a guarantee. The only question is timing. And the precious metals suggest that timing is now, not in some distant future, not when economists finally acknowledge what markets already see. Now, while everyone debates diplomacy and analyzes geopolitics, while they focus on personalities and predict negotiations, the metals are telling a different story. A story about systems under terminal stress, about wealth-seeking safety, about capital flowing toward the only assets that don't depend on promises, institutions, or political stability. That story is just beginning, but it's already changing everything for those who understand what they're watching.